democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Rio+20 Earth Summit has concluded. We're returning to our conversation with Canada's leading environmentalist, David Suzuki. I spoke to him about the largest UN conference ever and asked him about his own family background and how he became the renowned environmentalist he is today.
Well, I was born in Vancouver, British Columbia in 1936. My mother and father were born in Vancouver in 1909 and 1911. I am what Japanese call a third-generation Canadian. My mother and father had never been out of Canada. They were citizens all their lives. They couldn't vote until after World War II. And when World War II happened, although we were full Canadians by birth, we were regarded as enemy aliens, as were Japanese Americans. We were incarcerated in camps. And then as the war was coming to an end, we were told that we had two choices. We could sign up and get a one-way ticket to Japan, which for us was a foreign country, or we could get out of British Columbia, go east of the Rockies. And so because we only knew Canada, we went east of the Rockies, and I ended up in Ontario. Now, you know, after the war, my parents said the way out of our poverty was hard work and education. And fortunately, both of those things were possible for me. And then a very amazing thing happened. I was offered a scholarship from an American college that was worth more than my father earned in a year. In 1954, Amherst College in Massachusetts offered me a scholarship for $1,500 because Amherst believed that foreign students added to the education of American students, and they were willing to pay money to have a foreign student come and be part of that college. And for me, Amherst College made me as a scholar, and I'm ever grateful to the United States for that. In 1957, when I was entering my last year in college at Amherst, on October 4th, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. We had no idea there was a space program. And in the months that followed, we saw the American rockets take off and explode either on the launching pad or once they got into the air, they exploded. Meanwhile, the Soviets launched the first animal, a dog, Laika, the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, the first team of cosmonauts, the first woman, Valentina Tereshkova. Americans realized, holy cow, the Soviets are very advanced in science and technology. They didn't roll over and say, oh my God, they've got too big a lead. We can't afford to do this. It'll destroy the economy. They simply said, we've got to go and beat these guys. And, you know, even though I was a Canadian living in the States at the time, all you had to do was say, I love science. And Americans just supported you, threw you into universities, and I got a graduate education and a training that I could never have got in Canada. And, well, what happened? Kennedy declared a race to the moon. Americans are not only the first and only country to reach the moon, but think of all of the spin-offs, the unexpected spin-offs that came from that commitment to beat the Russians. I mean, you've got 24-hour-a-day newscasts. Well, maybe that's not such a great thing, but you've got GPS, you've got cell phones, all of the things that came about simply because America said, we've got to make the commitment and we've got to beat the Russians to the moon. And it doesn't make sense to me that there's all a sense of, oh my God, you know, we can't get off fossil fuels, it'll destroy the economy. This is not the American way. The American way is to meet that challenge and realize huge things will happen once we make the commitment. We can't anticipate. Certainly in solar panels, certainly in geothermal energy, there are huge opportunities. The America that I knew and loved would have said, this is a challenge. American know-how will lead the world and create jobs at the same time. So I'm astounded at the position the United States is in today compared to what it was like when I graduated from Amherst College.
David Suzuki, I wanted to ask you about the mass student protests that have been taking place in Quebec province. You wrote in a recent piece, governments all across Canada have no qualms about investing vast amounts of money to exploit natural resources, yet they all but ignore the most precious, our children. In the United States, there is very little written about or very little coverage of these mass student protests that have been taking place, some of the largest in Canada. Talk about what you see has to happen.
Well, Quebec is a very, very different society, and I'm very proud that they've remained in Canada. They reflect a great deal of a value difference, so that the environment, for example, on Environment Day this year, attracted 300,000 people on the streets of Montreal for Earth Day. They attracted over 100,000 people objecting to the student tuition increase. Now, the English press in Canada has portrayed this as these spoiled brats in Quebec. They don't realize they've got the cheapest tuition in all of Canada, and they're objecting to a few $100 tuition raise. No, that's not what it's about. They're saying that they like to look to countries like the Scandinavian countries, even France, where young people are regarded as the most precious commodity, where they are supported and their universities are free if they reach a certain level of ability. They're supported through the system, and that's what the Quebecois are trying to tell us. But no, we portray this as spoiled kids that don't want to spend any more money. I don't think that's what it is. But of course, Charest, the premier, who in some areas is quite progressive in the environment, for example, but Charest has brought in really very severe, draconian legislation to suppress this kind of public dissent. And now that's what's attracting more kids to the streets, to say this is not a civil society any longer when you suppress us in that way. So what underlies the student protests is, I think, a very profound question about what are our values in our society.
David Suzuki, your long-running CBC show called The Nature of Things explores environmental diversity of the planet. Can you talk about some of the experiences and discoveries that have had the most impact on you? And in these last few minutes, because climate change is so little addressed, while weather is increasingly on every channel and it says extreme weather, severe weather, the other two words, global warming, rarely flash, if ever, on the networks. Can you talk about what's at stake for people to even understand, since in the United States it's even a debate, given the amount of money oil companies pour into the global warming denier groups, it's even a debate whether, in fact, this really is a concern?
Well, it's astonishing to me, because I want to remind your viewers that in 1992, an American president had declared himself, well, in 1988, he said, if you vote for me, I promise I will be an environmental president. That was George H.W. Bush. There wasn't a green bone in his body, but the American public had put the environment at the top of its agenda. He had to say that. Many people say George Bush came to Rio in 1992, so he should be recognized for that. George Bush wasn't going to come to Rio unless they watered down the climate convention. They were aiming at the original plans were for a 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in 15 years. George Bush said, I am not going until he got a much watered down target of stabilization of 1990 levels by the year 2000. And he came down and signed that. But he was, his actions were predicated on American concern about the environment. But since then, of course, we've gone into recessions, but I think we have not recognized that you've got people like the Koch brothers, you've got these right-wing think tanks, Competitive Enterprise Institute, the Heartland Institute, these that are the Heritage Institute, that are all now pushing a radical right-wing agenda funded by fossil fuel industry and rich people to say this is not true, which is undermining scientific credibility. June 7th this year, Nature is filled with articles from scientists who have looked at the ecosystems of the planet. We're in deep trouble. We are facing an absolute crisis now. But countries like Canada and the United States, which are endowed with huge resources, can float by on the assumption everything's okay. We don't see the crunch coming as countries like Europe are seeing. seeing. They don't have the kind of resource plenty that we have in North America. And so they're seeing it, and they're leading the call for change. But we have the illusion that the economy is the source of everything that matters, and we've got to keep that growing at all costs. It's at all costs to the future for our children and grandchildren.
Speaking of children and grandchildren, in 1992, David Suzuki, you were in Rio with your daughter Severn, who was then 12, who gave this remarkable address to the Rio Summit, the first Earth Summit.
You don't know how to bring the salmon back up a dead stream. You don't know how to bring back an animal now extinct. And you can't bring back the forest that once grew where there is now a desert. If you don't know how to fix it, please stop breaking it.
That was Severn Suzuki. David, that was your daughter. It's now 20 years later, and you are now back in Rio with Severn, who's now Severn cullis-suzuki, and with your grandchildren, her 2 sons. Can you talk about what it meant to you for her to give that address 20 years ago, and where you see we are right now?
Well, it was a remarkable speech, and at the end of her talk, she got a standing ovation. She went back to sit with us. Al Gore came up and said, "That's the best speech anyone has given at this conference." And the power of her speech, which, by the way, she and the other kids together wrote. Her mom and I didn't have any input. She said, "Dad, I know what I want to say. I want you to tell me how to say it." But she wrote that speech, and a child speaks from the heart. You know that there is no hidden agenda. They just speak in that childlike way of innocence. And that was the power. Her words had power because they came from that kind of innocence. Now she's back. She's brought her youngest son. The only reason I'm here is because I said, "Sev, I don't believe these conferences achieve anything, but I'll go as your babysitter." And I'm here as a babysitter. You just happen to corral me because I'm here looking after the baby. I got to get back and take care of my grandson. But I can tell you she feels unbelievably desperate, because she says the problem is that we've got a breakdown in governance. Leaders came here in 1992. They were moved by a child's plea, a child's request to do something for her future. And now those leaders aren't here, and there's no one accountable for the fact that they failed fundamentally. And now there's a new set of leaders, and they're making the same kind of promises without any understanding of the urgency of the crisis we face. And so she comes to this with from a very dark place, by the disillusionment of her childlike belief that our leaders will truly lead and care about a future for her children. And now she's got an investment into the future, and that makes her even more desperate about the lack of governance.
Well, David, talking about taking care of your grandson, if you were in charge, if you could have anything accomplished right now, what are the steps that you feel are most important to take right now?
Well, you know, the thing we hear over and over again is that we need a paradigm shift. It's become a cliche. But I absolutely believe this is the critical change, that all of this stuff that goes on will not achieve anything unless we ultimately see the world in a different way. You see, our beliefs, our values shape the way we look out at the world and the way we treat it. If we believe that we were here, placed here by God, that all of this creation is for us, it's for us to go and occupy, dominate, and exploit, then we will proceed to do that. And that's the paradigm we now exist within. And we're driven then by that sense that it's all there for us. We need to shift that to a better understanding that we are part of a vast web of interconnected species, that it is the biosphere, the zone of air, water, and land, where all life exists. It's a very thin layer around the planet. Carl Sagan told us that if you shrink the Earth to the size of a basketball, the biosphere, the zone of air, water, and land where all life exists, would be thinner than a layer of saran wrap. And that's it. That's our home, but it's home to 10 to 30 million other species that keep the planet habitable. And if we don't see that we are utterly embedded in the natural world and dependent on nature, not technology, not economics, economics, not science. We're dependent on Mother Nature for our very well-being and survival. If we don't see that, then our priorities will continue to be driven by man-made constructs like national borders, economies, corporations, markets. Those are all human-created things. They shouldn't dominate the way we live. It should be the biosphere. And the leaders in that should be the indigenous people who still have that sense that the earth is truly our mother, that it gives birth to us. You don't treat your mother the way we treat the planet or the biosphere today. But if we don't make that fundamental shift, then we'll just go on, oh, we got to be more efficient, we got to have a green economy and all that stuff. But we haven't fundamentally changed in our relationship with the biosphere.
And if we do treat it in that way, what needs to happen?
Well, I think then we have to reassess everything. We have to set, I believe, we have to start with the fundamental understanding that we are animals. And believe me, I've said that in many parts of the United States, and people get mighty pissed off at me when I tell children, don't forget we're animals. They say, don't call my daughter an animal, we're human beings. We don't even want to accept our biological nature. But as animals, our absolutely highest need for survival and well-being is clean air, clean water, clean soil that gives us our food, and energy from the sun that plants use for capture by photosynthesis. That's what we depend on. So how could we, claiming to be intelligent, use air, water, and soil as a garbage can for our waste and the most toxic chemicals ever known on the planet, as if somehow that's not going to have consequences? The minute you accept that we are biological creatures, then our highest priorities become absolutely clear. We've got, that means stop all release of any kind of human-created material into our surroundings until we learn ways to recycle that and mimic nature in how we create and then degrade those things. Then we have to say we're biological, social animals. And as social animals, what is our most fundamental need? And to me, this was shocking when I began to read the scientific literature. The most important thing we need is love. Children, to grow up to be fully formed and developed human beings, need love at very critical times in our development. If you look at children that grow up under war-torn conditions, in genocide or terrorism, and see children deprived of love, are fundamentally crippled physically and psychically. Well, that means then we've got to work towards creating strong families and supportive communities. We need full employment. We need equity and justice. We need freedom from war, terror, and genocide. To me, those are my issues, because if you don't have that kind of a society, you can't have a sustainable environment. Hunger and poverty are my issues, because a starving person who finds an edible plant or animal is not going to say, oh, I wonder if this is an endangered species. They'll kill it and eat it. I would, and probably you would too. So we got to deal with these issues, and then we say we're spiritual beings, and as spiritual animals, we need to understand that we're part of nature, that we emerge from nature and return to it when we die, that there are forces out there that we'll never understand or control. We need sacred places. To me, those are what we construct as the foundation of the way that we live. And then we say, how can we create an economy that will allow these fundamental needs that we have to be protected? How do we construct a way of living as a species, protecting these values? But if we don't see what the primary needs are, then I just think that we're just playing at the edges and we're not being serious about reaching a truly sustainable future.
That was David Suzuki speaking from the Rio+20 Earth Summit in Brazil just before it concluded on Friday. More than 120 world leaders attended. Greenpeace called the summit an epic failure. David Suzuki is a Canadian author and environmentalist, best known for the long-running CBC program, The Nature of Things. His latest book is Everything Under the Sun: Toward a Brighter Future on a Small Blue Planet.